We've had some weather, haven't we? Alright, we've all seen the footage. All looks a bit apocalyptic, doesn't it? My name's Dave Borlase and I'm not a scientist. I'm not a climate expert either, to be honest, but I would like to know what's going on in our Earth's climate and whether enough's being done to minimise the damage that we're apparently doing to it. So this channel is all about discovering the science behind the climate debate and finding out what our governments and politicians are doing about it. But also, just as importantly, I'm going to be taking a week-by-week look at my own lifestyle to see if there's anything I'm doing that's unnecessarily stupid when it comes to the climate and the environment. I do have a sneaky suspicion though that as the weeks go by and I look more and more at the people taking the decisions that affect energy management and resources, that while some of them will be very smart people doing very good things, some of them might be muppets. To make sure we don't lose track of these people, we're going to be plotting them on our purpose-built Muppet Genius chart. Here we are, Bert Einstein in the top right and Bert off of the Muppets in the bottom left.
He's a Muppet.
I reckon I'm about in the middle of these two characters, so I'll put myself in the centre as a control position, and as the weeks go by we'll be placing the people we learn about on the chart. And the more smart stuff they do, the closer they'll move to Einstein, and the more dumb stuff they do, the more they'll creep towards Muppetry Corner. Anyway, back to the weather for a moment. It did turn out that 2017 was actually quite an enthusiastic year for weather. Pretty much every week last year, somewhere on the planet, there was an extreme weather event that caused a massive amount of financial and physical damage to the area it hit. And sadly, in many cases, people died. Now, I know we've always had extreme weather events from time to time, of course. Just ask dear old Michael Fish here.
Good afternoon to you. Earlier on today, apparently a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
But not as often as this lot. And the weather in these 2017 events had way more energy in it than weather did in the past. So the size and strength of the impact really did take people by surprise around the world. And as a consequence, those people were often not able to prepare properly to cope with the onslaught. So is it fair to judge climate change on the strength of a single year? Was 2017 like a freak of nature? Should we perhaps heed the words of the great philosopher Aesop? Like a kid's book. A spendthrift, who had wasted his fortune and had nothing left but the clothes in which he stood, saw a swallow one fine day in early spring. Thinking that summer had come and that he could now do without his coat, he went and sold it for what it would fetch. A change, however, took place in the weather, and there came a sharp frost, which killed the unfortunate swallow. When the spendthrift saw its dead body, he cried, "Miserable bird, thanks to you I am perishing of cold myself." One swallow does not a summer make, you know, like don't jump to conclusions on the strength of a single piece of evidence. But then I looked back a bit further and I discovered that 2017 was the third warmest year on record, and the 2 years that were warmer than 2017 were 2015 and 2016. So then I looked back even further still and I discovered this graph, nicknamed the hockey stick graph for reasons you'll see in a second. It was plotted by a climate scientist called Michael Mann back in 1999, and it shows how the global average temperature began to increase exponentially as we moved towards the latter part of the 20th century. 2015 and 2016 were also heated even further by the El Niño effect. I don't really know what El Niño is, if I'm honest, so I've created another board of words to follow up. I'll jot down anything I'm not sure about as we go along, and I'll make sure I come back and have a look at each of them in more detail in future programmes. Despite all that though, there does still seem to be some disagreement. So what's real and what can we believe? Is this bloke right?
It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry.
Or is this bloke right?
How much time does the human race have?
I can't imagine there will be a human on the planet in 10 years.
No. There are some facts that everyone seems to agree on, right from the most apocalyptic doommongers to the most sceptical climate deniers. Number one, fossil fuels are a finite resource. They are going to run out. How quickly they run out turns out to be a very tricky question to answer. There's two numbers to think about really. Obviously the amount of actual stuff in the ground, but also the number of people who are using the fuels. And the more of us there are, the quicker we'll burn through the resource. When I was born in 1969, there were 3.6 billion people on the planet. That number's risen so rapidly during my lifetime that the population has more than doubled, and today there are more than 7.6 billion of us. Africa's population is set to rise from about 1.3 billion to 2.5 billion, resulting in a global 2050 population of 9.7 billion. And statistical models predict we'll actually hit 11.2 billion people by 2100 before the population numbers peak and level off. And thanks to the wonders of modern technology, you can even sit and watch these numbers going up right before your eyes. This is a population counting clock you can find at www.worldometers.info, and I'll put a link to their site in the comments section below. So based on the likely energy consumption of that growing population, if you're starting a family in 2018, then the current global proven reserves of oil will run out by the time your kids are my age. And natural gas will run out about 2 years later. That does leave about 100 years worth of coal, of course.
Beautiful, clean coal.
It's not beautiful, and it's not clean, Donald. Number 2, the planet is warming. Right now, the average global temperature is 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels, that's to say before 1750. The recent Paris Climate Agreement is an attempt to keep that temperature rise below 2 degrees, because that's the point at which scientists tell us we'll lose control of our climate. Right now, it's looking very unlikely that we'll achieve that the way society currently operates. In fact, if no radical action is taken extremely soon, then our 2018 kids stand a very good chance of seeing temperature rises of between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius during their lifetime. Now that might not sound like a lot, we get much more variation in temperature than that from one day to the next, but as a global average temperature increase across the whole planet, it makes a huge difference. The average temperature during the last ice age was only 5 degrees cooler than it is now. An increase of 2 degrees would mean sea levels several metres higher. And at 4 degrees warmer, most places south of the UK will be more or less desert. So 11 billion people by 2100 will be competing for somewhere to live and something to eat and drink. Seemingly small differences in temperature do have a dramatic effect on our environment, which brings us to the third of our agreed realities. Number 3, the increase in temperature is due almost entirely to increases in CO2 and methane in our atmosphere. And the American Geophysical Union, which is a proper United States congressionally appointed body, approved by the White House, believe it or not, said in their climate science report back in December 2017 that all of the warming since 1970 is due to human activity. 100%. Now obviously greenhouse gases are vital for keeping our planet nice and warm. Up until now, they've kept us at an average of 15 degrees Celsius. Without them, the planet's average temperature would be minus 18 degrees Celsius. And at that temperature, all the water on the planet would freeze, the oceans would be ice, and life as we know it would not exist. Earth's got a natural carbon cycle, which regulates the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I am no expert on that, so I've put that on the WTF board as well, and we'll have another look at that in more detail at a later date. Number 4, Arctic ice is melting at an alarmingly increasing pace, much faster than scientists previously thought. And the reason for that is, as well as the temperature rises affecting the top of the ice and melting it in the normal way, the warming seawater is also undercutting the glaciers and acting as a lubricant, speeding up the rate at which huge areas of ice are sliding off into the sea. That means even more sea level rises and even more moisture in our already energetic atmosphere, which means more extreme weather events. On top of that, as the ancient permafrost thaws, all the organic matter from all the animals that died thousands of years ago starts to thaw as well, just like meat in a deep freeze during a power cut. And as that happens, all the microbes and bacteria start nibbling away at it, and as they do that, they release huge quantities of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas that's at least 23 times more powerful than CO2. So that floats up into the atmosphere, causing more warming, which in turn causes more Arctic ice to melt, and you've got what the scientists call a feedback loop. I'll put that on the board as well. Number 5, last but by no means least, we're stripping away huge swathes of forestry land to make way for grazing pasture, for cattle and other livestock, for mega farms. As more and more of this land is cleared, not only are we taking away the ability of trees to absorb CO2 and give out oxygen, but also, by virtue of hundreds of millions of farting cows and other livestock were producing 2 billion tonnes of methane a year. To make matters worse, we're also producing another 2 billion tonnes a year of nitrous oxide, which is another potent greenhouse gas. And that's being produced as a result of the preparation of all the food we're making to keep all these animals alive just long enough so that we can kill them and eat them. But why should we get involved? Surely it's down to our governments to sort out anything that's got the word global in the title, especially if the next two words are climate and crisis. Well, I had a look at that as well, and here's what our governments have achieved on environment and climate science during my lifetime. 1969 was the year that NASA first put a man on the moon, and although I was only 3 months old at the time, people say there was a huge spirit of optimism about the new space age, and perhaps understandably, not much appetite for listening to what the mainstream then regarded as a bunch of hippies talking about caring for our environment. Nevertheless, in that same year, a guy called John McConnell proposed an annual Earth Day, and the first one came into being the following year. 2 years later, the UN created the United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP for short. By 1975, the global population stood at 4 billion, and a US scientist by the name of Wallace Brooker coined the phrase global warming for the very first time, using it as the title of a scientific paper on the subject. So emphatically was his paper received by world governments that absolutely nothing whatsoever happened for the rest of that decade, and for almost the whole of the 1980s, until the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which restricted the use of chemicals that damage the ozone layer, and which therefore earns a green tick for progress. 1988 saw the birth of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and then in 1992 at the first Earth Summit in Rio, governments agreed the United Convention on Climate Change. In 1995, the Conference of Parties, or COP1, was set up by the United Nations. Most of us have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. That came along in draft in 1997 with the aim of allowing big polluting countries to use what were referred to as carbon credits for smaller polluters in exchange for financial and technological aid packages. What followed was a failure of governments at COP4 to agree or adopt the terms of Kyoto, the US and EU failing to agree carbon reduction levels at COP6, George W. Bush officially withdrawing the United States from the entire Kyoto process in 2001, and Russia failing to ratify Kyoto at COP8, saying they needed more time to think. Nevertheless, in 2005, the protocol became international law for all those countries still left inside it, but even those laws were only binding until 2012. Then world politicians scored a spectacular own goal at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, failing completely to extend terms for Kyoto beyond 2012. Another opportunity was missed by COP16 in 2010, when the proposal for a $100 billion Green Climate Fund was rejected, and the second post-2012 phase of Kyoto could still not be agreed upon. We hit the 7 billion population mark in 2012, and at COP18 in Qatar that year, Kyoto was finally amended, just in time, although only relevant to 15% of global emissions, because Japan, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, New Zealand, the United States and Canada all refused to take part. The planet passed a pivotal point in 2013 when CO2 concentrations went above 400 parts per million for the first time in human existence. As a species, we'd now entered uncharted territory. A small ray of hope actually came out of COP21 in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was more or less universally adopted. This governs climate change reduction from 2020 onwards. More than 55 countries joined, representing at least 55% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Then 2016 happened, and you don't need me to tell you about that. Suffice to say that in 2017, Donald Trump declared that he was withdrawing the United States from the 2015 Paris Agreement. So we arrive at CO2 levels of 409 parts per million and a global temperature of 1.6 degrees higher than the 20th century average, and it looks like any international progress during my lifetime has been pretty much completely cancelled out by disagreements and setbacks along the way, with the result that even after 50 years of awareness of the problem, we still have no set geopolitical direction that's agreed by all the major countries of the world. Oh, I just need to put a couple of additions on one of the boards before we carry on.
Oi, Muppet!
Now, here's a little bit of history for you. In 1939, at the start of World War II, the British government produced 2 million posters designed to be distributed everywhere in the UK in the event of an actual German invasion. You all know the poster. Here it is. It was the perfect message to appeal to British stoicism and to ensure that everyone behaved in the correct way should the challenge arrive. The challenges of the 21st century look like they're no less serious, but this time, carrying on business as usual will not be the answer. Holding our elected representatives to account and applying whatever financial pressure we can to the worst corporate offenders will of course be absolutely vital, but we can all do our bit as well. If everyone makes their own positive adaptations to reduce CO2 levels, then the cumulative result will be massive. I did make some major changes to my own home last year, which we'll take a look at in more detail in later programmes. But there's also loads of other just as important but less financially impactful adaptations that I'm keen to learn about over the coming months. Now obviously I'm not the first person to do this, no doubt plenty of you out there have done or are doing a similar thing. And if so, then I'd love to hear your top tips in the comments section below, and in fact I'm really hoping that your feedback and experience will build into a kind of best practice hub that we can all tap into. As well as looking at my own activities in 2018, I'm also going to try and separate fact from fiction and myth from reality when it comes to all the major areas affecting our climate. Along the way, I'll be bringing you all the latest announcements, achievements and events from the UK and around the world. I'll be finding out much more about all of that as the weeks go by, plus sharing my own experiences and all of your top tips in a new programme every Monday. Until then, thank you very much for watching, have a good week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.